A significant part of the interior of every fort was taken up with barrack buildings. These long buildings were characterized by a series of compartments, or contubernia, with a larger house for a centurion or decurion at one end. Scholars have tended to assume that the first permanent barracks are simply a version of the tented arrangements recorded by ancient writers when they describe armies on campaign. A barrack range would thus be allocated to a century for 80 or so soldiers, or a turma for about 32 cavalry troopers, depending on the unit type. In reality, we can see that it wasn't necessarily quite that simple. Many barrack blocks have more space than we think a regular century or turma might require, but this is still a good way to think about the basic layout of these complex buildings. Within the barrack blocks, the organisation of contubernia is further subdivided to allow for an inner and an outer room. Both these rooms, we believe, would have served a contubernium, the basic infantry section of 8 men. It's widely suggested that one of these 2 rooms was for the soldiers to store their equipment, another for them to sleep in, but it's quite possible that individual groups adapted their quarters to suit themselves. Despite all the barracks that we've identified, we cannot speak with confidence about the arrangements of beds or furniture, although the location of hearths is often very clear archaeologically. For many years, archaeologists wondered where the horses of cavalry soldiers would have been kept. Recent work suggests that the distinctive, extended pits found in rooms along one side of barrack sites, such as those found in the southern part of Wall's End Fort, were actually placed there to facilitate the mucking out of horses. Extrapolating from the idea that these rooms would have accommodated 3 small Roman horses each, it appears that we can now see how turma barracks were organised, with 3 troopers occupying a room with a hearth backing onto the rooms where an equivalent number of horses were accommodated. The barracks were very much the focus of life for soldiers. There were no separate mess halls for soldiers to eat in, so food had to be eaten there, and, so far as we can tell, there were not normally special armouries either, so equipment had to be cleaned and maintained in the soldiers' quarters too. But there's growing evidence too that there was more to life in these barracks than even this would suggest. The soldiers were probably not the only people living in the fort. They had servants to be accommodated and families too. While some of these may have lived beyond the fort walls, it seems increasingly likely, particularly towards the later period, that many actually lived inside the forts themselves, and that surely meant in the barracks. Next week, we'll be looking at the archaeological evidence for these underrepresented groups too.